Up. New link works. It looks like everyone can hear us and engage with us. Folks, we're going to start up from the beginning. I'm sorry, folks, for the technical difficulties. Thank you for being so understanding and sticking with us. My name is Rajiv Srinivasan. I am the moderator of the 99 Pages Book Club. I'm broadcasting from South Lake Tahoe, the reading capital of the world, and I'm excited to be here. So 99 Pages Book Club is all about making reading fun and achievable for all. We're on this mission together, and really it comes from my belief that reading makes us better people, makes us more passionate and better citizens, happier people, wiser people. And I'm just so excited to make reading fun and achievable for everyone here and across the world that we can touch. We're starting off this club with the book 5 Days by Wes Moore. This chronicles the 5 days in Baltimore after Freddie Gray died in the hands of the Baltimore police. Obviously, this made big news around the world. And of course, after the events with George Floyd, this has become a really important topic for folks of all backgrounds to discuss so we can learn from each other. And I think this book is going to be a great platform for us to get to know different sides of the story, different sides of the country. And I'm really excited and grateful that you're all going to be on this journey with me today. One thing I want to do is introduce our panel. And if you haven't already, introduce yourselves by going into that chat window. Tell us where you're logging in from, what your favorite book is. Let's get to know each other a little bit. I want to start off by talking about my buddy, Bobby Merriweather. I'm going to spotlight his video there. Forgive my Zoom DJing skills, still very new. Bobby comes to us from Philadelphia, where he grew up amongst some, everything from gang violence, just poverty, just in this rough situation. And he used the Army to pull himself out and give himself some opportunity. He then moved out to the Bay Area and picked up a career in technology. And we've grown really close over that. He's now a cybersecurity consultant with Palo Alto Networks, just absolutely crushing life. And I'm just so proud of him and grateful that he's able to make some time for us today. I also want to make sure that we're going to introduce Cal Walters. Cal is another one of my best friends from the military. I've gotten to know him so well over the past 2 decades. And then he pursued a career as an Army lawyer. He's now the Chief of Justice at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he oversees all criminal justice activity and legal proceedings for the entire base of 50,000 soldiers or something. It's a very impressive job, and I'm so proud of him. I also want to give him a shout out. He is the host of the Intentional Living and Leadership podcast. Check it out. Amazing conversations with leaders and how they think and feel and grow. One of my favorites. I also want to make sure we introduce Stesha Doku. Stesha's been one of my friends since way back when, being Black, female, LGBTQ, she has definitely faced her share of adversity just with those identities. And yet she still managed to go to Duke for undergrad, Stanford for her medical school, and then Harvard for her residency. She's a world-class anesthesiologist, and for some reason hangs out with me and is one of my close friends. I'm so excited to get her perspective on this situation and, what it's like and how it feels like. What is the formula to overcome adversity? And then lastly, we got Jackie Newman. I've known Jackie since I was, I think, in summer camp when I was 11. Jackie, if you look at her CV, she's been to the world's most amazing institutions, and yet she comes from a family of educators and has dedicated her life to a career of public service in serving the education need in this country and bridging that opportunity gap. I'm just so proud of her and really excited that she can be on with us today. So that's our panel. And if you don't mind, I'd like to dive in with some questions. And Jackie, you were a public school teacher in Baltimore. I'd love to just start off with you. And if you could tell us a little bit about what that city is like. What can we learn about Baltimore from you? Like, can you give us a sense of the vibe of the city?
Okay. So my husband and I, we spent a combined 2 decades in Baltimore. We love its neighborhoods, we love its people, and there's this thriving community of social entrepreneurs like Wes Moore and hundreds others who are trying to do better, as Wes Moore put it in his dedication. However, I should note up front, my lived experience as a white woman in Baltimore is worlds apart, cannot even be compared to the Baltimore that Freddie Gray lived and died in. I think Wes Moore in the book describes, the difference between West Baltimore and the Inner Harbor as like 2 different countries. My high school students called the city Murderland, and my white affluent peers called it Charm City. And Because Baltimore has a legacy of institutional racism and oppression. It was the first US city to legalize residential segregation. So that, on top of decades of economic decline, misguided criminal justice policies, and a hopelessly inadequate educational system, I mean, that's kind of what has created this concentrated poverty described in the book. Now, I don't want to leave it at just that. I mean, Baltimore is more than how it's depicted on The Wire or how it was depicted in the news after the murder of Freddie Gray. Baltimore is a city full of hope. And like I said, it's full of pastors, teachers, community leaders, librarians, entrepreneurs who are all passionate about changing the narrative of the city.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Jackie. And I know we got some Baltimore librarians on our feed today. We are so grateful for you making time for us. Bobby, I got a question for you building on that, man. And I know you're not from Baltimore,
Right on.
but like you and the author have kind of a similar narrative here. And even in the beginning of the book, I think it was in the introduction, I actually noted the page here. I believe it was on page 6. He's actually like traveling from Baltimore to go to Boston on this on a talk, right? And he's reflecting back on, you know, after going to the funeral for Freddie Gray, and he says, man, you know, I'm complicit. This is a book about complicity, mine included. And I didn't really understand that. I mean, he's a successful Black man. He's a shining role model for this community. Why would he feel complicit? So, Bobby, I'd love to ask you, man, do you ever feel complicit as a successful Black man who's emerged from these sort of situations? And what does that statement mean to you?
That's actually a really great question. And when I read the book, I did find a lot of similarities in his trajectory in life and similar to mine. I think the complacency, it happens when you just get complacent, honestly. Sometimes you get lost in, the tunnel vision of your personal successes and your personal wins. And, in the environment where people are congratulating you for achieving what they deem as a success, that you oftentimes don't remember that there are people just like you that have not been afforded those opportunities. They do not have the resources that you may have either been provided or may have found out just by, poking your nose in the right corners of the world. So I think when he mentioned that statement, he was commenting on how sometimes he got lost in the complacency of just basking in his own personal wins, that he has to remind himself like, hey, the battle's not done. And I'm not really successful until I can help other people like myself grow and find a way out of whatever predicament they're facing. So I do find myself doing that sometimes. So I always try to stay engaged wherever I go. I've been in 48 states. I'm from Philly. I'm from a place we call Uptown Philly. Pretty rough neighborhood, East Germantown. There's rougher neighborhoods all around Philadelphia. But one thing I've noticed from going around the country as well as around the world to different minority-based communities that might experience a lot of these rough environments is there are a lot of people that are looking for hope. So to Jackie's point, a lot of cities like Baltimore have a lot of hope. So it's our responsibility as a whole. But I resonate with what Wes Moore was saying, that as Black men that have experienced some levels of success, or Black women as well, to go back to those areas and help people see that there's other ways they can take to achieve their version of success as well.
Bobby, we had a question come in on the chat that I want to go ahead and ask you. It's from Al Chase. And I think it's a really interesting question. You're a combat veteran. Could you compare that level of complicity to survival guilt potentially? Like what it's like when you know that, just like some of the folks that you may have grown up with didn't make it out. Is it comparable to say when, let's say, a soldier in Iraq or Afghanistan that we served with, like when they don't come out, is it comparable at all?
Yeah, actually, I just got chills when that question popped up. So thank you for that. That's actually a hard one. Something I probably have to chew on a little bit because I have been deployed. I was former infantry officer. I've been deployed to Afghanistan, led over 200 troops in total in combat situations in a very highly kinetic environment. And I'm also from, as I mentioned, a rougher part of Philadelphia. So I guess you could have what some may say is survival's guilt. However, I'm all about solutions. And it seems like Wes is similar in that mind state. So instead of resonating on that guilt piece, it's okay, recognizing, okay, I feel some kind of way about maybe it might be guilt or any other kind of feelings. Let me do something about it. What am I going to do? Let's establish a program, like a foundation that he's created to help people get to a certain level of success. So I guess you could contribute it to something similar to survival's guilt, but it's recognizing that feeling and doing something about it is what's really going to make the change. So thanks, Alan, for that question.
Right on.
Hey, Rajiv, can I follow up on that real quick?
Please.
And
Thank
Bobby,
you, Kyle.
yeah. Well, Bobby, it's interesting just hearing you talk about that. It makes me think of a professor I had in law school. He was a Harvard Law School graduate. He was Black. And he said sometimes, no matter all that he had achieved, to some people, he was still just a Black man. And, after achieving all of that worldly success, it was almost harder for him because he knew that no matter what he achieved, to some people, that's all he would be. And I'm just curious, and maybe that's, maybe Stesha can relate to that as well, but maybe that's the opposite side of that coin. On the one hand, you feel guilty, but on the other hand, maybe to some people, you still are just a Black man. I'm curious if you've ever felt that way.
Absolutely. I actually thought about that just before we got on live. If, despite my level of success in life, which is, not much compared to a lot of people.
Yeah, right.
But no, seriously, when I'm riding down the street and there's a police officer following me, I still remember, at the end of the day, I'm still a Black man. So I still have those same fears of, to be blunt, could I die today? If I get pulled over, if this officer might not like me just because of the way I look, could things escalate to a situation that might have me something in an environment similar to what Freddie Gray experienced, or a lot of the other African Americans that have passed away in similar situations. So you're absolutely right, Kyle. I experience that every day. I'm sure a lot of people experience that every day, and that's something we want to highlight here, so the broader community can understand that, and just have a better perspective on how to deal with that as cases come up. So thanks for asking that.
Yeah, and I think it just
I'm
sorry, and I think it just highlights for me as a white man, I never feel that way. And honestly, just hearing you say that and hearing other people I've heard say similar things, it honestly just breaks my heart. It kind of breaks my heart that exists. I still don't know quite what to do about it, but I guess I would just say that I really does break my heart, and I appreciate you being willing to share that. So
virtual hug. Hug. Thanks, Cal.
Stesha, I'd love to bring you in and give you a chance to answer this question, because very similar. I mean, look at all the things you've accomplished, and I think it's very easy to look at you as an example of what right looks like. But do you ever feel complicit?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I think that this sort of speaks to the idea of institutional racism, right? Like, it doesn't matter how much you may have achieved, someone walking on the street is going to make an assumption about what kind of person you are, where you come from, what you do, without knowing anything about your background. And so it makes it very difficult for people to feel like they can rise above that, because racism doesn't really have a, merit part to it. It's all about what people see and making interpretations or expectations about people based off of that. And certainly in my life, I feel like I have achieved quite a lot, but certainly feel like at times that people may look at me and I don't know what they're, in their hearts they may have, but it's always a challenge to wonder sometimes about what people may think.
Man, I'm sincerely, again, just like Cal, I'm sorry that you have to feel that way, because you are sincerely one of the most accomplished people that I know. And for you to have those levels of insecurities, that just, I think for me actually just hits to my core. So another virtual hug. Can we make that a thing? Is that Zoom
let's
needs to work on
thing.
its reactions. It needs a virtual hug reaction.
Yeah, there should be a button for that. I agree.
Indeed. Cal, I'd love to bring you in, man, because you got this really interesting perspective as a prosecutor, and the law enforcement community here, and especially when I read Partey's story. And as they talk about the events, like these guys getting out of the van, pursuing Freddie, and he had a pocket knife in his pocket. I guess, really what I'm trying to get at here is, like, can you give us a sense of, like, what law enforcement and, the prosecuting attorney, like what is going on through their heads right now. Because another thing we learned in the book, quite frankly, is that this was not Freddie Gray's first encounter with the police, right? He'd been brought in multiple times, and there's evidence that he had some neurological issues due to lead paint poisoning, right? So we know this character. He's been arrested, a dozen times or so. Like, can you help us put in the frame of mind of what like the police officers and the attorneys are thinking when they approach Freddie Gray?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And when I read this and I think about this case, as a prosecutor, I immediately think of the difficulty of trying to prosecute a case like this. We often have cases like this where there's no video, there's no conclusive direct evidence that shows what happened. And so what you're often left with is several people's perspective, what they will be able to testify about what happened against someone else's perspective. In this case, it's going to be the police officer. And I think what people, well, I'll at least say what I didn't realize before I went to law school and before I became a prosecutor is just how high of a standard beyond a reasonable doubt is. In our society, we would rather a guilty person go free than an innocent person be wrongfully convicted. Of course, there are people wrongfully convicted all the time, but we have a very high standard for beyond a reasonable doubt. We also have this thing in society called CSI effect, where everyone has seen something like CSI, where our society expects conclusive evidence to get to beyond a reasonable doubt. So I bet, let me ask you, Rajiv. So between 0 and 100 being absolute certainty, and actually everyone, think of a number in your mind, 0 being no certainty, 100 being absolute certainty, what number would you assign to beyond a reasonable doubt?
I would maybe 85.
Okay. Well, what did you say, Bobby? 70, something in the 70s?
70s. Yeah.
What about you, Jackie?
And you're just thinking, like, what percentage do I need to feel is right in order to say beyond
What
reasonable?
number? Yeah. What number comes to mind on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being absolute certainty for beyond a reasonable doubt?
I mean, given our history of putting innocent people behind bars, it would have to be like 95%.
Okay. Now I'm talking about for you. What number do you think personally, if you were sitting on a jury, if you had to assign a number to it, would it be about 95%?
95%, like really.
Okay. What about you, Stesha?
Yeah, I'm with Jackie on that one. I feel very strongly that like I know there's going to be uncertainty, but I need to be pretty sure it's 95%.
Yep. So here we are, and I'm probably 85 or something like that. Here we are, 5 people that could be sitting on a jury who have very different views of what beyond a reasonable doubt is. So that's one thing I think that I certainly didn't appreciate before I became a prosecutor. So, and in this particular case, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rajiv, but you basically had the testimony of several people about what they saw. You had the testimony of a police officer about what he or she, or several police officers, about what they were thinking at the time, what they saw. And so really this is a, he said, she said case, as you often hear in the context of sexual assault. And those are just really hard cases to prove. So that's one of the first things that comes to my mind, Rajiv, when I think about this case from a prosecution standpoint.
Cal, I think that's such an interesting perspective because that innocent before proven guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt, these are things that are meant to protect society. And it's just so interesting that we've now uncovered a couple instances where people actually feel that we're protecting the institution. We're protecting law enforcement at the expense of society. I think it's a really interesting topic to double click on. If you guys don't mind, we have some really interesting questions coming into the chat that I think I would love to give some time to. Jackie, I'm going to bring you in to answer this because you're from Baltimore, or you spent a lot of time in Baltimore. And this is actually from Julie Drury. Miss Drury, thank you so much for coming in. Miss Drury was my high school teacher in Roanoke, and had a wonderful career with the Roanoke County Public Schools. Thank you so much for coming in. But she asked this question from the teacher's point of view, how did your students react to the Freddie Gray aftermath? And I know you may not have, I think you had some time in Baltimore right before and right after. I know you had, you had to go to school and things like that before you returned to Baltimore, but maybe you can kind of, from the students' perspective, what were your students feeling, or if you could comment on that?
Yeah. So I was in grad school during the uprising. I moved back when I graduated in 2016. So I kind of feel like what Wes Moore said at the beginning. It felt like MIA, and he had that guilt for that. It felt symbolic that he wasn't there on the ground for his hometown when it was going through this. But when I came back, I was teaching high school students, and just, we're only talking about the first 99 pages. We're going to get to what happened at Mondawmin Mall, and we're going to talk a lot about how students felt. But on one hand, for them, it kind of like for many Black people after George Floyd, they're like, yeah, we knew about this. Like, this is our everyday life. Why this is surprising to you that this is what happens to Freddie Gray? This is what's been happening for decades. And, the federal investigation of the Baltimore City Police Department after Freddie Gray in August just revealed its racist and violent practices. So for my students, there was a little bit of, we're really upset, but also a little bit of, yeah, like, this is the reality here. And kind of what Bobby mentioned at the beginning, like, they're so busy just trying to get through their everyday life that it's not like every day they can, we have some amazing Baltimore activists like DeRay McKesson, who really have dedicated their life and are doing this full time. For my Baltimore students, they're trying to juggle a job with school, whether they're in school or they're in community college or they're working, they're providing for their family. Like, they are angry, but they're also a little bit, they got a thick skin, and it can be sometimes a little bit just numb to all of this injustice because they're used to it.
Wow. Unreal.
Absolutely.
Stesha, I actually would love to bring you in for a question that we came in, and I want you to answer it because this question came in from my mom and was +1 by my wife. So we need a really good answer for it. Okay. So I'm going to put it.
All right, bring it on.
My mom asked, do you find that the younger generation is more enlightened about racism? Will this be a non-issue in 25 years? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I think that especially in this time, right? So like looking at August 2020 versus even March 2020, the conversation about racism has really shifted. And I think that in March 2020, people were thinking about racism in terms of individuals, right? So like, what was in people's hearts? Do people have racist or bigoted thoughts? Are people like Trump? Are they like the white supremacists? Are they saying things that are supposed to sort of incite people to think about racism, or maybe, think about a group in a way that might not be positive? I feel like now in August 2020, and a lot of that has to do with George Floyd, why that didn't happen with Freddie Gray, I'm not sure. But the conversation has switched a lot more to the idea of institutional racism. So what are our policies? What people are looking back and realizing that policies, laws that have been enacted a long time ago were in some ways intended to with surgical precision, sort of keep people from being able to thrive in their communities. But there's also some implicit bias that really does exist, and people are becoming a little more attuned to that. And I think because the younger generation sort of has these ability to now talk about these a little more openly, that the conversations we're going to continue to have with the younger generation as they get older is going to be very different. I think that they're just a little more attuned to what racism may look like, and that it may not look in the form that people have described in the past. And as a result, their ability to feel sort of empowered to make a difference is very different than it was before.
Fantastic. That's excellent. And I also want to call out some really interesting comments that we got from Tosif Kidwai. He said, and I know Tosif very well, one of my closest friends. Tosif said that, and Tosif is of Indian descent just as well. He says, after being frisked in the street by 3 Seattle Police Department officers, I can relate to the fear felt by Bobby, but I do admit it cannot compare to anything that African Americans face. I'm just curious, Bobby, when you hear that, do you have a reaction to that? Like, are there really degrees of racism in should, folks who are not Black, like when they're stopped and frisked by the police? I've been stopped by cops, who, when I was driving a fancier car, it happened to me. And I'm just curious, man, like what would be your guidance to folks like myself or Tosif who, experience this, but we're not Black, like we're not really sure how to be owners in this problem?
That's a great question. Hence the pause. And I appreciate that sentiment, sir. And one of the things that kind of resonates with me is when people can empathize and when they can just have more of an appreciation, that's a win for me. Now, everybody's different. Everybody reacts different. But for me personally, as a Black man that have experienced a lot of this in my lifetime, I appreciate that empathetic perspective, as well as sharing your perspective on that as well. Because one thing that you probably could not highlight in the 200 characters on this chat is, how you actually felt. And I can understand that feeling, and the fact that you had a feeling that you could base that into the empathetic perspective you have for African Americans. I think that's a win. Like for instance, for me, I remember coming home from West Point, and my mom and I were just baking a cake. Well, she's baking a cake. I'm prepared to eat it. It's 8:30 in the morning, and we're in East Germantown in our home, and our door gets kicked open, and we have 4 locks on the door and a Rottweiler in the backyard. So in our neighborhood, if your door gets kicked in, you don't know who that is. And thankfully, or maybe not thankfully, it was actually the police. And they came in with their guns drawn on my mom and I shielded my mom. They said, we have reports of you shooting in here. I'm like, it's 8:30 in the morning. We're in the kitchen in pajamas baking a cake. Does it look like we're shooting? Get out of my house. So that that's the kind of stuff that I kind of grew up with. My journey to West Point, for instance, and last story is, I was in New Jersey at the West Point Prep School, and we were stopped every weekend and pulled out the car and just asked random questions like, where are you guys going? What do you plan to do tonight? Stuff like that by the police. So the fact that you can empathize with that from a particular instance in your life is a win for me, because a lot of Black people experience things like I've experienced and way worse. So I think, just general understanding and appreciation for what people of color go through when they're in those situations is a win. And we need to translate that to the majority.
Super interesting, and thank you for that, Bobby. I want to go back to some of these prepared questions, because I think there's some really interesting elements in this book that I want to hit on. And Stesha, I want to bring you back in because you and I have had a couple of discussions recently, and I remember you saying as you started to read this book that you noticed aspects of the narrative that made you think not just about the events in the 5 days, but even in the way the story is told, there are elements of bias that even a pair of Black authors may be, triggering some implicit bias inadvertently. And your comments were just so insightful. And I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing that with the crew.
Yeah, definitely. For me, like whenever I read something, I think a lot about, like you said, like how the narrative is told. And this book is really interesting because they walk you through several different people and don't just tell a story about what happened in the 5 days, but tell you a perspective from multiple different people and how they sort of experienced it and what was going through their head and how they may be involved. And like in the 99 pages, we haven't necessarily seen those paths cross yet. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that might happen or how these things converge and how those conversations happen. But I did notice, and some of that is just, for me being a Black person reading this book and looking to see how people of my color are represented in the book, there were many instances that sort of drew on some stereotypical aspects, right? There were some instances where I saw that Black men, where they would just say young men, and they always referenced, or there were a couple of times that they referenced pants hanging low, or that their pants weren't pulled up, which is a sort of this stereotype that we sort of have with Black men. And it was interesting to see it sort of written in this form in this book. There are some references to gold teeth. There is an instance you might remember where Nick Mosby, the councilman, his father, who is an absentee father, rolls around the corner in a black Cadillac and, just rolls down the window and gives his kid some money. And these are all sort of images that seem like they're sort of out of Hollywood. You know what I mean? Like they sort of draw on our implicit biases of how we sort of imagine Black people in Baltimore to be. And these very well might be instances that, are, true in the community, but they represent such a small sustenance, I think, of what Baltimore people are probably like. And what Jackie said in terms of like, there's so much, diversity within Baltimore, and there's so much that there is to see there in terms of types of people and how they interact, that I felt like this was such a small and narrow drawing, somewhat on implicit biases, that it'll be interesting to see how those things sort of unfold as we go through the rest of the book.
Ooh, Stesha, I've read the book and I didn't even think and pick up on some of that. I will say it seems really hard to be a writer, because I remember, one of my students had 7 teardrop tattoos. So if I were to write about my teaching experience and this incredible story I had with this student who I'll nickname D, if I included that detail, would that be racist? Because it would trigger your implicit bias about people with face tattoos, or what specifically teardrop tattoos mean. Or, it would be more racist to leave it out, because it's a huge part of his identity and how he chooses to present himself to the world. So I agree. And I feel like Westmore tries to choose the kaleidoscopic, as he calls it, accounts to paint a picture of diversity. But I love you for calling out this idea of portrayals and stereotypes.
That is a really good point about the fact that it can very much be about people's identities, right? I don't know. We just basically have this narrative, and so we'd have to dig further to find that out. But it's a good point to make, that sometimes these things that we see superficially are very much about people's identity too.
Stesha and Jackie, there are 2 kind of comments in the chat that I think relate to this. I'm going to start with Lisa Bassarge, and I apologize if I do not pronounce your last name correctly. But you talked about Ibram Kendi's participation and his work on anti-racism. And I also want to bring in a question from Ranjana, my little sister, who actually is a PhD in counseling psychology and has done a lot of work in the world of microaggressions. And I think this is an important question that she asked. Do you think racism just looks different now, as in utilizations of these microaggressions instead of overtly racist comments? And the reason why I think this relates to the Ibram Kendi book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is one of the things he does is he calls out that, there's different types of racism, right? And I think when a lot of folks who don't believe there's a problem, what they're really referring to is biological racism. Like, I'm not a racist because I don't believe a Black person and a white person are fundamentally, one's better than the other. I believe they're both equal. All right, now that's interesting, and that's cool. But there can be invocations of racism based on, culture, on socioeconomic status, on gender, on sexual identity. There's layers of outcomes that are different. And I think when we think about microaggressions, even though it may not come from a biologically racist place, did you ever feel like, kind of the slight, even my inability to pronounce someone's last name, or, the inability to tell a narrative about a Black community without highlighting these details? I mean, is that actually part of the problem, or are we carrying a anti-racism hammer and everything looks like a nail? I'm struggling to find out, like, where is the line of like what is right and I can say it and it's okay and it's acceptable in telling a detail of a story, versus where no, now we've crossed the line. Now this is actually considered a microaggression. Stesha or Jackie, I know that was a little bit of a longer, convoluted question, but any thoughts on what a microaggression actually means today?
Well, my initial reaction is, while there are millions of microaggressions committed every day, what this book is about is like systemic aggression against Black people. So like, I could definitely talk about microaggressions, but we have a larger problem still today. We obviously had the funeral of a great American hero, John Lewis, on Friday. And while we don't have police brutally beating up a large protest, we actually do still see that happening today. And so, of course, we can talk about like microaggressions and how we characterize individual Black people. But what I think we need to have a conversation about is, a question in the chat was like, what does racism look like today? It's like, it is still a part of everyday massive aggression, not just microaggression. So that was just my initial reaction to your question, Rajiv.
But okay, well then I guess a follow-up would be, and I think where the microaggression comes out is like, is a let's call it the macro aggression, I guess, is the actual violence a symptom of underlying day-to-day, like small little death by 1,000 paper cuts that manifest itself into the platform where these massive atrocities happen? Or maybe they're completely separate. Like, actually, Bobby, Stesha, like, do you view them as related or completely separate?
I think racism is a taught behavior and not a innate behavior. And people can be taught many ways. It could come from your number one source, which should be those who nurture you from birth, or your family environment, or even your community. And one of the other sides a lot of us don't talk about is the racism from even like for Black people looking at other races as well. It's just all about prejudices and trying to combat that. But I think it's a taught thing and not something that's naturally a part of people. So I think there is a lot of microaggression that's at the foundation of a lot of the macro events that happen. So I agree.
I certainly think that it involves both, right? There are those microaggressions, but I agree that the conversation now is about what are those macroaggressions and what is it that we are looking at in terms of racism on a larger scale, and how do we symptomatically, take each piece and figure out how to make solutions for it.
I also just want to
Oh, go ahead.
a lot of microaggressions come due to segregated neighborhoods and a lack of affordable housing so that we could have diverse, thriving communities in school. If you grew up with Bobby on one side of your house and Stesha as your other neighbor, like, you'd be like, oh my God, Black people, they're intense and crazy and amazing. So like, I just think a lot of this is a product of we don't know each other, and we don't grow up knowing each other as neighbors and community members. And we really need to end segregation.
Boom. Well said, Jackie.
Kudos to that.
Cal, I know you wanted to chime in. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I was just curious, when you're all using the term microaggressions, like, what comes to mind? What's an example or two that you're thinking of when you use that term?
Walking through a mall and older white lady clutches her purse, not knowing my background, that I actually served in the military and all the other things like that. So that could be a sign.
Yeah, and that's helpful. And I think even just you sharing that, Bobby, helps me get a glimpse into, I just want to go back to something you said earlier about how empathy is a win in of itself. Often when we talk about race, I'm kind of thinking like, okay, what can I do about it? What steps can we take? What policies can we implement? How can we solve this problem? Or how can we in some ways help this tension? And I think you saying that is helpful, because I do think empathy is a step towards progress. It's something we all take. There was one of my friends who posted something about being a Black man who runs. And he just talked about how he's a Black man, he's in the service. And when he goes for a run, he has to be very careful about what he wears. His wife has to tell him, hey, wear something colorful. You don't want anyone to view you as suspicious. And this is in Virginia. And that's just not something I didn't know that existed. But by him sharing that story, which is just normal life for him, all of a sudden through that story, I have a new glimpse into someone else's world. And so even just you walking in the mall and someone clutching their purse, that's a glimpse into your world that I didn't know. And I guess I would just encourage you and Stesha and like share those stories, because probably for you, it's everyday life. But for me, these are glimpses that I now have into a world that I otherwise don't know. So
yeah, I like to jump in on that too and kind of flip it to Jackie, because when Jackie's teaching in inner cities, there's a microaggression that Black people have is they come into an inner city school and they see a white teacher and it's like, okay, what's she gonna tell me? Because I know when I get out of here, I have to make it safe home. I have to pass these different neighborhoods. I might not make it safe home. So Jackie, like I would love to hear some of your perspectives and the things that you've experienced with those type of things and how you have overcame them.
Well, it struck me when I first read in 2015 that Freddie Gray got arrested for having a pocket knife. By the way, Cal, I don't know if that was a legal search to find that he had a pocket knife. But all my students, students told me in an after school session, actually during a book club, we were reading Westmore's The Other Westmore. They were like, we carry pocket knives to protect us on the street corners, right? Like if our bus comes at like 6:30 a.m. and it's still dark out, it's the winter, like we need to protect ourselves. So one, I just wanted to share that that's kind of like the lived violence my students deal with every day. Two, as a white woman, I acknowledge I do not know or share their lived experience. And so I was lucky as an English teacher, I could use journaling in my class as a way to get to know students. Journal prompts like our discussion questions help me get an insight into who they are, what they're passionate about. And you don't want to just hear the negative stories, right? You want to know what uplifts them and who their role model is and what they aspire to. But similar to a story that Bobby told about the mall, my program was about teaching entrepreneurship and design thinking to young people in Baltimore so that they could be the change makers the city needs. And two of my students were doing user experience interviews about a doghouse. Actually, they were kind of like redesign and innovate for the 21st century. And they're outside this pet store and they're trying to interview passersby. And I'm standing far away because I don't want to shepherd or helicopter parent them. I want my high school students to be on their own. And the woman came up and they were trying to talk to her. And I'm taking pictures. I want to document all their wins. And later we saw in the picture that this woman was holding onto her purse and had a pepper spray like ready that you could see. And so just walking up to them assumed the worst. And I've told this story to another person in Baltimore, a white man, and he's like, well, I had a violent experience in Baltimore, so I empathize with her fear. And I was like, but this was, broad daylight outside a pet store, and we had a good conversation about it. But it saddens me that my student entrepreneurs are this close to getting maced just by trying to talk to a white woman passing by.
Oh, wow. Even on that note, and I don't want to keep jumping in on this, but even on that note, I might be followed by, or a black man or black woman might be followed by a white officer, and instantly we think fear for our life. And that white officer might be the nicest person ever. So, I think everybody experiences that. And thank you, Jackie, for sharing that, because, we're all victims at some points in time. And sometimes we're all complicit as well.
One thing that brought to mind, and I've heard people use this as an example or make this comment is, what do we do about whether it be movies or rap music or anything that furthers that stereotype that we talked about earlier, that might, for a white woman walking in the mall, maybe that's the image she has, right? And then there are things like movies and music that arguably furthers that image. So I'm just curious, what do you guys think about that? Is that stuff that we should be trying to limit, or is that just kind of a part of the world we live in?
Well, I think when I was thinking about those things, that I realized that there's a little bit of a balance that needs to happen, right? Like those images are some experiences that people have, right? But I think that there also has to be images of all the positive, which is what I really like that Jackie was asking her students to really share, like the joys that they have, the experiences that they have that are really, really excellent. Because those things, and showing those as opposed to just only showing, the stereotypes, will really help people to have a much broader view of what other people's lives may be like. I think that's really the key, because it's hard to erase all those negative stereotypes that are out there. Instead, I think we should flood them with positives so that people see that there's going to be a lot of different people, and you can't assume that it's going to be one or the other. You have to experience for yourself which one it's going to be.
Well said. Folks, if you guys don't mind, I'd love to bring in some of the questions. We've got a really active chat here. First off, everyone on the chat, we have 33 concurrent viewers and 87 total playbacks. That has defied my expectations of what today would happen. Like I'm honestly touched. Thank you guys so much for engaging in this discussion. I think all of our hearts are just bursting right now. So thank you. I want to call out a question from Lejem Cambridge, one of my wonderful classmates from B School. Can you talk about the intersection between racism and classism? I feel like part of the inequality is related to socioeconomics, and it makes this problem harder to tackle. And I actually think there was Amitav brought up a comment, namely about like how a lot of schools are funded by property taxes, right? And so it's almost like this flywheel problem where if you're coming from a poor part of town, your properties don't get assessed very highly. And so the schools, don't get good. And so no opportunity ever comes to the community. And it's just a cycle. And so how do we talk about racism and classism in the same conversation, and be precise in terms of the problem we're actually solving? Like, is it really racism, or is it actually a really just a question of socioeconomic status that applies not just to Black people or minorities, but also to white people? I'm gonna call names. I know someone's got a thought on it.
I do think at the foundation it is a social economical issue, and I think that may stem into any kind of ism, any kind of prejudicial situation, whether it's racism, sexism, whatever it may be. So I do agree there, and I know in my perspective, in my history or my experience, I went to a school outside of my neighborhood, but then I had to come back to my neighborhood to deal with the neighborhood issues every day, for these similar reasons. And we still even had our issues there as well. So we do see that there's a lot of well-funded locations that aren't necessarily in your immediate environment, and that stimulates a lot of problems, both on the receiver side as well as the aggressor, I guess.
Fantastic. Thanks for taking that. I know that was a tough one, and I know there's more on that in the next 99 pages. We're going to get into that topic really deeply. This one is from my dad. So we have to get another good answer here. I would love to give this one to Cal, if you don't mind. Cal, my dad is asking, how did Obama's election and successful presidency as the first Black president impact racism? And I think what he's referring to there is, I think a lot of us, when President Obama was elected, first Black president, we felt like we were in this post-racial world. And then all of a sudden, what we discover is that we've actually stoked a fire. And I'm wondering, maybe you can help us understand a little bit about what were we missing? Like, what is going on in parts of this country that, us on the coastlines, in, big urban cities that are super diverse, and, we're all working for, on these coasts for these big companies. So we're kind of insulated from a lot of the rest of the country. I'm just curious, maybe you can help us understand, like, what were they seeing?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I don't know if I can answer that other than just to tell you how I've evolved a little bit over the last 6 or 7 years. When Obama got elected, I celebrated that in a lot of ways because, of course, he was the first Black president, and that was incredible achievement for Black Americans. And I felt like, wow, that just demonstrates that we are past racism. And then I saw all of this racial discussion, and my initial reaction is that is actually furthering the problem. It's that now we're talking about race more than we ever were, and the more we talk about it, the more it expands, and that's the problem. So we just need to stop talking about it, and it'll go away. And then I think over time I've learned that no, really, I think I'm not sure how, but I think it did bring to the surface something that had been existing the entire time. It's just not, maybe people didn't feel comfortable talking about it. Maybe Obama gave a platform to people to talk more about it. And so I think we're having a necessary conversation as a society right now. And I think going back to my initial discussion about evidence, now we have videos that you cannot ignore. We have a video of George Floyd. I mean, if you've watched that video, I remember when I watched that video, I forced myself to watch the entire thing. And I just sat there and I honestly teared up, and I said, how could this happen? How could this happen? And perhaps it's just a evil person doing an evil thing, or there's a problem that's much broader than this. And so I think we as a society are having a necessary conversation. And last thing I'll say is I think this conversation between 5 human beings and the 30 plus people that are commenting, this is healthy. And I think we need to have more of this and less sound bites and less polarization. And I think this is the type of stuff that I hope will help us empathize and maybe move forward unified, that we do have a lot more in common than that which divides us. So
Well said, Cal, man. I appreciate you taking that, because that's a hard question too, for anyone. So thank you for that. I'm going to take one more from the chat, and then we're going to start closing out here. I want to bring in Larry Olson, another huge advocate for the veteran community. Larry, I'm so glad you're a part of this right now. He asked, how do the panelists feel that Wes Moore and Erica Green, through their narrative nonfiction treatment of the story of Freddie Gray, touch upon these larger narratives we're discussing tonight? And yeah, I know that's a tough one to ask, a tough one to answer. Larry, I might need to I might need to revisit that one, because I think that might be a little deep. Larry is a very well-read guy, and I'm afraid of making a fool out of myself in front of Larry. So we got to watch out. Uh, but I want to bring in this last question. And folks, please keep the questions coming in. I know most of the folks on the stream, keep the questions coming in. We're going to address them. If not next time, we're going to, be active on social media. We want to keep this community engaged. We're going to be reading together every Sunday. So we got a long time and a lot of time to address this stuff. So let's make sure we stay connected. But I want to start closing this out here by asking a question that I got from a very close friend of mine, who had a really interesting, comment to say. He's like, look, when Freddie Gray died in Baltimore, and by the way, anyone who's watching the live stream right now, feel free to answer this question in your own words in the chat window, because I think this is a very important question here. When Freddie Gray died in the hands of the Baltimore police, 3 of those 6 officers were Black. The mayor was Black. The top 2 highest ranking police officers in Baltimore were both Black. The city council was majority Black. The state attorney who brought the charges against the 6 officers was Black. And the judge who tried 2 of those officers was also Black. And then, of course, the attorney general of the United States, Eric Holder, was Black. And the president of the United States, Barack Obama, was Black. So how on earth is this a question of institutional racism? And I thought that question really shook me up a little bit, and I had to think and process about that. And I'd love to just kind of see, as we close out here, maybe getting to the heart of this matter. Like, how is it that this is institutional when it clearly there was a Black voice at pretty much every level? Jackie, I'd love to call on you first, if that's all right. You're from Baltimore. This is your town that's so close to your heart. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit.
Yeah, wow, amazing question. First of all, Baltimore is a majority Black city, so awesome that its leadership reflects its demographic. So very proud that there are so many Black leaders. But saying just because there are Black leaders doesn't mean there's racist institutions is like saying, oh, well, President Obama was Black, so we're not a racist country. I mean, you can have great people trying to make amends, but sometimes I think what's more called the National Guard's being sent in as like a patch. Now that's a whole other question we'll of course get into in future talks, because it relates to what Trump wants to do for kind of some of the protests going on nationally. But again, Black people in leadership doesn't mean that the city as a whole, the way police are trained, the way the war on drugs has raged on and targeted Black men in particular, those leaders don't, I mean, it takes a lot to overwhelm decades and of oppression. So I think that leadership is a step in the right direction. But if you named like 9 people, those are like 9 steps in the right direction. And it will take a lot more to overthrow a system of oppression and racism.
Fantastic answer, Jackie. I'd love to give it back to the crew. Anyone else have a thought on that?
Yeah, Rajiv, I just wanted to add that I think that if you focus only on who was a part of, the cop squad who took care of Freddie Gray, or who were there when he died, that you miss all the aspects that put Freddie Gray in police custody in the first place, right? Like the fact that he was in a social economic disadvantaged background, the fact that he had lead poisoning, like we had talked about earlier. All of those things are part of the systems that ended up putting him in police custody in the first place. So if you really sort of focus on that aspect and what disproportionately gets Black men into the incarceration system as opposed to other races, then you find a different focus in terms of discussing what institutional racism is about. So it's not just about the individual people necessarily who are part of it, but about the processes that led to it in the first place.
Well said. Well said there, Stesha. Guys, I'm going to ask you one last question, and we're going to sign off here. I know we started a little bit late, had some technical difficulties. Appreciate everybody staying with us for a little bit. But honestly, I'd love to this last word to go to Bobby. Bobby, what gives you hope for the future? That is a question from Amitav Mishra that came in from the chat. And I just felt like that was just the right theme that we wanted to end our first live stream on.
I personally take it one day at a time. I have a strong spiritual foundation that I believe drives me to conquer whatever I might face. And I've experienced so many things in life, from, my days in Philadelphia growing up, as well as time spent in foreign countries and combat zones, to know that life is really too short to really just stay in a depressed state of mind, thinking that there is no hope. So I just try to take, one day at a time, live life to the fullest, and stay grounded in my faith that no matter what comes my way, I can fight through it. And I want to help other people do the same. That's what gives me hope.
I also just want to jump in. It's 5 years after Freddie Gray, and we are still talking about it. That is what it requires to make social change. We need to keep having these conversations.
Absolutely.
Boom. Well said. All right, team. I want to give, first off, a giant thank you to Bobby Merriweather, Cal Walters, Jackie Newman, and Stesha Doku for making time for us today. We're going to be back here, same time, same place. Well, we'll be on YouTube, and we're going to have these conversations continue on the next 99 pages. All right. So we're going to read a page 198. That's 99 plus 99. So we'll make it to 198 in case you can do math. I will also ask you guys to try and follow us on Instagram. Our handle is 99 pages club. That's, I think, where we're going to start managing this community. We're going to put out polls on what book we want to read next. We're going to start sharing titles and making sure that everyone's engaged and feeling included, and we can keep this conversation going. We'll actually make sure some of these questions get asked of our panelists, and maybe they can respond on social media between sessions. Folks, I am just, again, so thankful and grateful for your participation. Please, for next time, read if you can. If you can't, no worries. Still come and enjoy the discussion, and maybe bring a friend. The more people who get involved and kind of hear these conversations and participate, I think the more of a, just collaborative community we're going to develop. And that's the goal here. That's the only agenda. So anyways, folks, thanks again. I'm signing off here. This is Rajiv Srinivasan, and hope you all have a wonderful weekend. All the best.